Welcome to Grandfather Great Love. What you're about to hear is a deeply moving story about a man who gave everything to his son, only to be left behind when he needed love the most. But sometimes life holds secrets too painful to speak and too powerful to ignore. Stay until the end, because the truth this grandfather carried in silence will leave you speechless. Now, enjoy the story. My grandfather was a man of quiet strength. He didn't speak much about his feelings, but everything he did showed his devotion. He worked double shifts at the factory for over 30 years just to give his son a better future, one he never had himself. I remember how he used to come home covered in sweat and dust, but the moment he saw his son, he'd light up. He was the kind of man who built dreams for others, while never asking for anything in return. Even after my father, now a wealthy and distant executive, stopped coming around, Grandpa never uttered a single bitter word. "He's busy," he'd say with a half smile, "but he'll come by. One day." I was young, but even then I could tell. It wasn't hope. It was heartbreak, dressed up in patience. The old house creaked a little more with each passing season. The walls, once filled with laughter and stories, now echoed with silence. Still, every Sunday, Grandpa would wear his best shirt, set the table for two, and make his son's favorite stew. He'd hum softly as he cooked, glancing occasionally out the window, as if expecting a car to pull into the driveway. But no one came. Not on birthdays, not on Christmas, not even when Grandma passed away quietly in her sleep. That funeral was the first time I saw my grandfather truly break. And still, he didn't blame his son. "Grief does strange things to people," he whispered to me, staring at the empty pew where my father should have been. It was the only moment I ever saw a tear fall from his eye. What no one knew, not even him, was that something was already changing inside his body. He had always been strong, never complained, never sick. But the fatigue came slowly at first. Then the weight loss, the nights of coughing blood, the days when he could barely stand. "Just age catching up," he'd say, brushing it off like a stubborn stain. But I saw it. I saw the fear in his eyes when he thought I wasn't looking. The kind of fear you don't speak aloud. He didn't want to go to the doctor. Maybe he didn't want the truth. Or maybe he didn't think he was worth saving anymore. Not after being forgotten by the one person he loved the most. I remember the day I found him collapsed on the kitchen floor. The pot of stew he had been preparing was still warm on the stove, the radio humming an old jazz tune in the background. His hand clutched his side, his breathing was shallow, and yet, even then, he tried to smile at me. "Don't call anyone," he whispered hoarsely, as if admitting weakness was a greater pain than the one tearing through his chest. But I didn't listen. I called the ambulance, rode with him to the hospital, and waited for hours beside that cold hospital bed as they ran test after test. The diagnosis came like a thunderclap. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Irreversible. Aggressive. Limited time. I stared at the doctor's mouth moving, but the words didn't feel real. And when I turned to look at my grandfather, he didn't flinch. He just nodded, as if he had been expecting something like this all along. Back at the house, he sat in silence for a long time, staring at the family photo on the mantel. One taken years ago when my father was still smiling, still present. "I wonder if he'll care," Grandpa said quietly, more to himself than to me. There was no anger in his voice, just a heavy kind of sadness that felt impossible to comfort. I offered to call my father, to tell him everything. Maybe hearing that his father was dying would stir something in him. Maybe it would break through whatever cold wall he had built between them. But Grandpa shook his head. "No, don't tell him. If he wanted to be here, he would have been." His eyes never left the photo. "People show you who they are. Son, you just have to believe them the first time." It was the first time he'd spoken of my father with such quiet finality, and it broke me. Over the next few weeks, I became his full-time caretaker. He refused chemo, refused pain meds, unless absolutely necessary. I want to feel it, he said. I want to be present, every second I have left. He moved slower each day, but his spirit, God, his spirit, was unshakable. We sat on the porch most evenings, wrapped in blankets, watching the sun sink behind the trees. He told me stories from his youth, about how he met Grandma at a county fair, how he once got into a fistfight defending her honor, how he held my father for the first time and felt like the world had finally given him something worth living for. There was so much love in those memories, so much history. And yet, the one chapter he never reopened was the chapter that still haunted him, the day his son walked away and never looked back. The weeks turned into months, and I watched the strongest man I knew fade into someone the world had forgotten. But not me. I saw him. I saw every wince he tried to hide, every moment of breathlessness, every trembling hand that refused to ask for help. The cancer didn't just take his strength, it took his independence, and for a man like him that was the deepest cut. Still, every morning he made his way to the kitchen, clutching the wall for support, insisting on making his own coffee. A man has to keep doing something, he'd say with a raspy laugh. I wanted to scream sometimes, at the world, at my father, at the cruelty of it all, but I stayed silent. I knew he didn't want pity. He wanted dignity. He wanted to be remembered as he had lived, proud, humble, full of love, even if that love was never returned. Then one day the doorbell rang. It was unexpected. No one ever visited. I opened the door to find a letter left in the mailbox. No return address, no name. Inside was a formal invitation. My father was hosting a gala in the city, a fundraiser, an event covered by press, politicians, celebrities. I stared at the gold-trimmed card, stunned. My name wasn't even on the guest list. The envelope had been sent to Grandpa, a cold, impersonal gesture, as if after all these years of silence, an invitation to a party could patch the hole left by abandonment. I showed it to him, unsure how he'd react. He just stared at it for a long moment, then said, he finally remembered I exist. Right before I don't anymore. The pain in that sentence cut deeper than any diagnosis ever could. But then he surprised me. Maybe it's time I saw him again, before it's too late. I didn't expect him to say yes. I didn't expect him to want to go. But something shifted in him that day. Maybe he wanted closure. Maybe deep down he still believed in the son he raised, the boy who used to ride on his shoulders and laugh until he couldn't breathe. I helped him prepare. We got his best suit dry cleaned, shined his shoes, even trimmed his hair. He looked frail, yes, but he looked like the man he once was. As we sat in the car headed for the city, his fingers trembled slightly in his lap. Do you think he'll recognize me? He asked. I didn't know how to answer. The truth was I wasn't sure if my father was even capable of recognizing anything anymore, especially not the love he'd spent so long running from. But I nodded. He'll know. And if he doesn't, we'll make sure he remembers. The city lights blurred past the windows as we drove into a world that had long forgotten men like my grandfather. Towering buildings, luxury cars, men in suits with urgent phone calls and empty eyes. It was all so foreign to the man who once believed that hard work and decency were enough. We arrived at the venue, a sprawling marble hall bathed in gold, and crystal chandeliers, where laughter floated through the air like perfume. I could feel his breathing grow shallow the moment we stepped inside. Not from fear, but from something deeper. The weight of decades, the memories he had tucked away, the hope he had buried. He's here, Grandpa whispered almost to himself. His eyes scanned the room slowly, methodically, like he was searching not for a man, but for the little boy he used to know. My father stood near the stage, surrounded by politicians and wealthy donors, a wine glass in one hand, charisma in the other. He looked polished, important, untouchable. When he finally saw us, I expected something: shock, guilt, maybe even a flicker of remorse. But all I got was a strained smile. He walked over slowly, almost hesitantly, and said, "Dad, you came." My grandfather didn't speak right away. He just looked at him, not with anger, not even disappointment, but with a quiet curiosity, like he was searching for traces of the son he once knew in the man who now stood before him. "You look well," Grandpa finally said. My father shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure of what to say. "I've been busy," he replied, as if that could explain years of silence, but Grandpa just nodded. "So I heard." The rest of the night was a blur of awkward conversation and forced pleasantries. My father never asked how he was feeling. He didn't know. He didn't care enough to ask. At one point, he turned to me and said, "Thanks for bringing him. It's good for people to see we're a close family." That was the moment I realized this wasn't about reconciliation. It was about appearance, optics. My father didn't see a dying man who had sacrificed everything for him. He saw a prop, a symbol of humility to impress the donors. I felt my hands curl into fists, but Grandpa gently touched my arm. "It's okay," he whispered. "He's just doing what he knows. But I know something too. This is the last time I'll ever see him." There was no bitterness in his voice, just peace. He wasn't here to be forgiven. He was here to let go. The ride home was silent. My grandfather leaned his head against the window, watching the city lights disappear into the night like distant memories. He didn't speak for a long time, and I didn't press him. I could tell something in him had shifted, something final. As we pulled into the driveway and stepped back into the familiar quiet of his small home, he paused at the front door and took a deep breath, as if breathing out years of unspoken pain. "That chapter's closed now," he said softly. I needed to see him one last time. Not because I wanted anything back, but because I needed to know I wasn't the one who gave up. He sat down slowly on his favorite chair by the window, the one where he used to wait, and stared into the darkness outside, not with sorrow, but with acceptance. In the days that followed, his body began to give in more rapidly. The decline was sharp, almost cruel. He stopped eating, slept more, spoke less. But he still smiled when I entered the room. He still whispered thank you every time I helped him stand or brought him water. And one night, as I tucked the blanket around his legs, he looked at me with a tenderness that felt almost holy. "You stayed," he said. "That's all a man really wants at the end. Someone who stays." I held his hand and nodded, but my throat was tight with emotion. I realized in that moment that this story, his story, wasn't just about a father and a son. It was about what we choose to carry when others let go, about the weight of loyalty and the quiet power of love that asks for nothing in return. One morning, I found him asleep in his chair, a small photo album resting on his chest. It was filled with old pictures, some faded, some torn, but each one holding a fragment of the man he had been. I watched him for a moment, the slow rise and fall of his breath, and something in me broke. I sat beside him and opened the album, flipping through the pages. There he was, holding my father as a baby, teaching him how to ride a bike, standing proudly at his high school graduation. So much love, so much effort, so much hope. And yet, not once had my father looked back. I wanted to understand it. I wanted to find some reason that could make sense of the abandonment. But all I found was a simple truth. Some people don't recognize treasure until it's buried, and by the time they do, it's too late. As the days slipped through our fingers, like sand, Grandpa began to speak in fragments, short memories, unfinished thoughts, soft whispers that drifted into the quiet of the room. Sometimes he thought I was my father. He would look into my eyes and say things like, "I'm proud of you, son," or "Don't make the same mistakes I did." At first, I tried to correct him, to remind him who I was, but eventually I stopped. I let him believe, just for a moment, that his son had finally come home, that he was no longer alone. And in those moments, something softened in his face, a peace I hadn't seen in months. It hurt more than I expected, because deep down, I wished it had been true, that my father had come, Not for a gala, not for show, but for love. For redemption. I started writing things down, his stories, his phrases, his habits. I didn't want the world to forget him the way his own blood had. I wrote about how he took his coffee, how he tucked his napkin under his chin, how he used to hum Sinatra when he washed the dishes. I wrote about the way he folded his shirts with military precision, how he called the sunrise God's curtain call, and how he still apologized to ants when he stepped on them by accident. He was a man full of contradictions, tough as leather, soft as silk. And in that small home, with the walls closing in and the clock ticking down, I promised myself something. I would not let his love die in silence. Even if my father refused to see it, the world would. Somehow they would. Then, one night, he asked me to bring him the old radio, the one with the crackling dial and broken antenna that barely worked. I set it beside him, and after some careful tuning, the sound of an old song came through, a jazz ballad he used to dance to with Grandma in the living room when they thought no one was watching. He closed his eyes, leaned back, and whispered, "She's waiting for me." That's when I knew we were close, the kind of close that makes every second ache. I sat beside him, not saying a word, just letting the music wrap around us like a warm memory. And in that stillness, I realized something I hadn't before. My grandfather wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of being forgotten, but not anymore. I would carry him with me, always. In the final week, the house became more like a sanctuary than a home. I lit candles every night, played the music he loved, and opened the curtains so the sunlight would pour in gently each morning. Every detail mattered. The way the sheets were tucked in, the warmth of the soup I brought him, the softness in my voice when I greeted him. I treated those moments as sacred because I knew we were walking on borrowed time. Some mornings, he didn't speak at all, but he always squeezed my hand. That was his way of saying, "I'm still here." I started sleeping on the couch, just in case he needed something in the middle of the night. I didn't want to miss a single breath, a single whisper, a single goodbye. I wasn't just losing my grandfather. I was watching the end of a story that deserved to be told word for word. One afternoon, the phone rang. It was my father, the same voice I hadn't heard in years, now suddenly asking, "How's he doing?" I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask why it took cancer and proximity to death for him to pick up the phone. But I stayed calm. I told him the truth, that Grandpa didn't have long, that he still hadn't asked for him, but that he still kept his photo by the bed. My father went silent. Then he muttered something like, "I'll try to come," and hung up. He didn't say when. He didn't ask for directions. And in that moment, I understood. Some men aren't built to face the pain they've caused. Some run because it's easier to pretend nothing happened than to admit they failed someone who once gave them everything. And maybe that was his curse, living in denial while the man he betrayed faced the end with grace. That night, as I sat beside Grandpa, he looked at me with eyes clearer than they had been in days. "You've done more for me than he ever did," he said, his voice fragile but steady. "And you're not even my son. You're my legacy." I couldn't hold the tears back. I leaned in, held his hand to my chest, and told him what I had been too afraid to say, that he had raised me too, that in all the ways my own father failed me, Grandpa had stepped in and filled the void. "I love you," I said, not like a grandson loves a grandfather, but like a son loves a father. He smiled, eyes full of tears, and whispered, "Then I didn't live in vain." That was the moment the weight lifted. All the pain, all the abandonment, all the waiting. It dissolved into something beautiful, something eternal. Love returned. The final morning came with a silence that felt different. Not empty, not hollow, but still almost sacred. The sun hadn't risen yet, but I was already awake, sitting by his side with the window cracked open to let in the soft breeze. His breaths were shallow, his chest rising just barely, but there was no panic in the room. No fear, only calm. I held his hand and whispered memories to him. about Grandma's biscuits, about the fishing trips we used to take, about the way he taught me to tie my shoes with a double knot. I didn't know if he could hear me, but I kept talking anyway. Because words, I realized, have power. And love, even spoken into silence, still echoes. Then, just before dawn, he opened his eyes, just for a moment, and looked at me, really looked. And with a voice barely louder than breath, he whispered, "Thank you for seeing me." Then he was gone. There are moments in life that divide time. That split your heart into before and after. That was mine. I sat there with him for a long time, not crying, not speaking, just holding on to the stillness he left behind. The sunrise poured into the room like liquid gold, touching everything it could reach. It felt like he had planned it that way, as if he wanted to leave with the light. I walked outside, barefoot on the cold porch, and looked up at the sky. I whispered, "He's free now." Not for anyone to hear, but because I needed to say it out loud. My grandfather had waited his whole life to be seen, to be loved, to matter. And even if his own son never gave him that, I did. And somehow, that felt like enough. It didn't erase the pain, but it gave it purpose. We buried him under the big oak tree behind the house, where Grandma had once planted her roses. It was simple. No suits, no speeches. Just a few neighbors, a handful of friends, and me. I read a letter I had written the night before. It wasn't perfect. My voice cracked. My hands shook, but it was honest. I told them about the man who raised a child who wasn't his, who waited for a son who never came, who died with grace and gave love without limit. And when the last word was read and the last flower was laid, I made one silent promise. I would never forget him. I would carry his name with pride. And one day when I have children of my own, they'll know the story of a man who was abandoned by his rich son, but who died rich in the only thing that ever mattered: love. After the funeral, the house felt heavier, not because of his absence, but because of everything he left behind that still whispered his presence. His slippers by the door, his jacket on the hook, the way his cologne still lingered faintly in the hallway. I couldn't bring myself to change anything. I left his room exactly as it was. I'd walk past it and pause at the door, half expecting to hear his humming again. Grief has a strange rhythm. It doesn't crash all at once. It comes in waves, sometimes soft, sometimes suffocating. And when it hit, I'd sit on the porch where we used to watch the sunset, clutching the armrest of his chair, just to feel closer to him. The world had moved on, as it always does. But for me, time had slowed, wrapped in the echo of a man who had given everything, and asked for so little. A few weeks later, my father showed up. No call, no warning. Just a car pulling into the driveway I hadn't seen in years. He stepped out wearing a tailored suit, sunglasses despite the cloudy sky, and an expression I couldn't read. He walked to the door and stood there in silence. I opened it, not because I wanted to, but because part of me still needed answers. "I heard," he said. "I was busy." I didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. He stepped inside, looked around, and for the first time, really saw the home he had abandoned. He touched the chair by the window, looked at the framed photo of him as a boy, and then, almost defensively, he said, "I didn't know he was sick." I stared at him. "You didn't care enough to find out." His mouth opened slightly, then closed again. For a man who had built empires, he suddenly looked very, very small. He asked if he could see the room. I led him down the hall. He stood at the doorway, staring at the neatly made bed, the half-read book on the nightstand, the radio still beside it. "He waited for you," I said, "every single day." He nodded slowly, tears beginning to pool in his eyes, but whether from guilt or regret I couldn't tell. "I thought I had time," he whispered. "You didn't," I replied, "and now the only thing you can do is live with that." He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at his hands. The silence between us was thick, and then, for the first time he asked me something I never expected. What was he like at the end? And I told him everything. Not to punish him, but because deep down, I wanted him to know the man he had missed. The man who, even with death at his door, still hoped his son would remember how to love. In the days after that visit, my father began coming around more often. Not to see me, not really, but to try and piece together the man he had chosen to forget. He asked questions, hesitant, almost embarrassed questions, about Grandpa's final days. What he ate, what he said, whether he ever mentioned him by name. I answered honestly. No sugarcoating, no softening the truth. He never stopped waiting for you, I told him one afternoon. Even when he was dying, he still set a second plate at the table. He still looked at the gate hoping you'd walk through. My father's eyes welled up again, and this time, I saw it clearly. Shame. Not just guilt, but the kind of shame that roots deep into a man's bones. I thought I had more time, he repeated, as if saying it enough could undo the truth. But some clocks only tick in one direction. Eventually, he asked if he could take something from the house, a keepsake. I walked him through the rooms until we stopped at the small drawer where Grandpa kept his watch. It wasn't expensive, just an old worn piece with a leather strap cracked from decades of use. My father held it in his hand like it was made of glass. He wore this every day, I said, even when he couldn't stand anymore. My father didn't respond. He just nodded and slipped the watch into his pocket. As he turned to leave, he paused at the doorway and said, "He was a better man than I'll ever be." I didn't disagree. Some truths don't need to be debated. Some wounds need to be felt before they can scar. And as he walked down the path, the house behind him, I realized something. This wasn't closure. It was consequence. Later that night, I sat alone at the kitchen table, running my fingers across the edges of the photo album Grandpa had left behind. I opened to a page I hadn't looked at in weeks, one with a faded picture of the three of us. Grandpa, my father as a child, and me as a baby in his arms. I stared at it for a long time, wondering what went wrong. Wondering how a boy so loved could grow into a man so distant. But I didn't stay there long, because I knew my grandfather wouldn't want me to. He believed in moving forward, in carrying the good and letting the rest dissolve with time. And so I closed the album, lit a candle, and whispered into the quiet room, "I'll keep telling your story. I'll make sure the world knows who you were." Because sometimes, the greatest tribute we can offer is to remember with truth, not perfection. The following weeks brought a strange calm, the kind of quiet that doesn't ache, but hums, like the sound of something settling into its final place. I returned to my routine, slowly, but with a changed heart. I noticed things I hadn't before. The way sunlight danced across the porch in the early morning, the sound of leaves rustling, like whispers Grandpa used to murmur when he thought no one was listening. His presence never really left. It lived in the smell of old books, in the way I stirred my coffee, in the silence between songs on the radio. I realized then that grief isn't about letting go, it's about learning how to carry someone differently. And in those quiet moments, I carried him everywhere. In the way I walked, in the way I forgave, in the way I loved people who didn't always deserve it. One day, while cleaning out a drawer in Grandpa's workshop, I found an envelope with my name on it. The handwriting was shaky, but unmistakable. Inside was a letter, just one page, written in pencil. It started simply, "If you're reading this, then I guess I've gone ahead of you. Don't be sad too long. I had a good run." I read it slowly, every word soaked in the kind of wisdom only time can offer. He thanked me for staying, for choosing love when bitterness would have been easier. He wrote about regret, but not for dying, for the silence he allowed to grow between him and his son. "Maybe I could have done more," he admitted, "but I gave all I had, son, all of it." And at the end, one final line, "You gave me the ending I never thought I'd get. And that means more than you'll ever know." I pressed the letter to my chest and cried, not out of sadness, but because I had finally heard the words I didn't even know I needed. After reading that letter, something shifted inside me. I stopped waiting for my father to apologize. I stopped trying to figure out why he failed to show up when it mattered. Because in the end, the love I was searching for had already been given to me in full, by a man who never had to, but chose to. A man who poured everything he had into people, even when they didn't pour anything back. And that became my new compass. I started living differently, more intentionally. I reached out to people I had grown distant from. I forgave where I had once judged. I listened more, spoke less. And every time I doubted myself, I thought of Grandpa sitting on that porch, smiling through the pain, choosing love until the very end. And somehow, that gave me the courage to do the same. A few months later, I received a letter from my father. Handwritten, surprisingly, though still guarded in tone. He said he had been thinking a lot, that visiting the house had stirred something he hadn't expected. It was like stepping into a mirror, he wrote, and I didn't like what I saw. He didn't ask for forgiveness, not directly, but he talked about memory, about guilt, about the echo of a man he'd spent years pretending not to miss. I see him in my dreams now, he wrote, not judging me, just waiting. There was pain in those words, and maybe beneath it, a desire for redemption. He ended the letter with a simple sentence. If you ever have a son, tell him the truth, not just the good parts. I folded the letter and placed it in the same drawer where Grandpa's final note rested. Because maybe, in some crooked way, that too was a part of the legacy. The seasons changed. The roses Grandma had once planted by the oak tree began to bloom again. I tended to them now, carefully, almost religiously. It became a ritual, a way of honoring the people who once filled this house with life. Every petal felt like a memory. Every thorn like a moment of pain we learned to carry with grace. Sometimes I would sit by the tree and speak to Grandpa out loud, knowing full well he wouldn't answer. But somehow, I still felt heard. You were right, I told him once. People show you who they are, and some people, when they realize it too late, live haunted by what they didn't do. I paused, looking at the horizon, and smiled. But I did. I stayed, and I'm proud of that. In a world so quick to run, to numb, to forget, staying had become my quiet rebellion, and his greatest lesson. Not long after, I began writing everything down, the full story, not just for me, but for anyone who needed to understand what love looked like when the world called it weakness. I didn't sugarcoat the pain, or the abandonment, or the heartbreak. I told it straight, a story of a rich son and a forgotten father, a story of a dying man and the grandson who refused to let him die alone. And in telling it, I found healing. I realized that sometimes the people who are left behind are the ones who end up shining the brightest, not because they were spared pain, but because they chose to love anyway. That was Grandpa's real wealth, not the land, not the house, not the savings, but the way he lived. And the way, in the end, he taught me how to live too. Some stories end in grand gestures, dramatic reveals, or miraculous reconciliations. But this one didn't need that. It ended in a whisper, a held hand, a quiet thank you. And honestly, that was enough. Because not all love needs to be loud to be true. My grandfather showed me that. He never fought for attention, never demanded affection. He simply loved, consistently, quietly, fiercely. And in the stillness of his absence, that love continued to echo. People in town began stopping me on the street, sharing their own stories about him. He helped me fix my porch once. He used to bring flowers to my wife when she was in the hospital. He told me not to give up when I lost my job. He left fingerprints everywhere, on hearts, on memories, on lives. And it made me realize something. Legacies aren't built with applause. They're built with kindness. Eventually, I sold the house. Not because I wanted to, but because it felt right. Grandpa would have wanted someone else to make new memories there. Someone to sit on that porch swing and fall in love with the sunrise. Someone to walk those old wooden floors and hear echoes of jazz in the walls. Before I left, I walked through every room one last time. I touched the door frames, ran my fingers along the worn countertops, sat in his chair by the window and just listened. The house was quiet, but not empty. It was full of him, of everything he stood for. I whispered goodbye, not with sadness, but with gratitude. Then I closed the door and stepped into a world that somehow felt bigger now. Not because he was gone, but because of everything he left behind in me. I moved to a smaller place, simpler, more manageable. But I brought two things with me, his watch and his words. That letter he left me sits in a frame on my desk, next to a photo of the two of us from my childhood. Whenever I lose direction, whenever the world feels too loud or too cruel, I read his words again. And I remember the man who chose love over resentment, dignity over despair. I try to be that man in small ways, holding doors open, saying I'm proud of you when it matters, staying when it's easier to walk away. Because love doesn't end with a heartbeat. It continues, through actions, through stories, through the way we choose to show up for others. My grandfather's story didn't end the day he died. It began again, every time I choose to live like he did. Over time, I started sharing his story with others, not just in writing, but in conversations, at cafes, on walks, in moments when someone confessed that they felt invisible, forgotten, unloved. I would sit with them and say, "Let me tell you about a man I knew who was abandoned by his own son, but never stopped believing in the power of love." And each time I told it, I could see something shift in the listener's eyes. Because deep down, we're all afraid of being forgotten, afraid of giving everything and receiving nothing. But Grandpa's story was proof that love, when real, doesn't need to be returned to be worth it. It transforms you from the inside. It builds something eternal, even in the silence. And maybe that's why his story matters so much, because it reminds us what it means to love without guarantees. I also began volunteering at a hospice. I didn't plan to. I just walked in one day, sat beside an old man who hadn't spoken in 3 days, and told him about my grandfather. He didn't respond, just stared at the ceiling. But when I finished, he turned to me and said, "I hope someone tells my story someday too." That was all I needed. I went back the next day, and the day after. I started listening, writing, holding hands, whispering comfort. Not because I was trying to fill some hole, but because Grandpa had passed me the torch, and I intended to carry it. In each fading face, I saw glimpses of him. In each goodbye, I honored his memory. And somewhere along the way, I stopped being afraid of loss. Because I had learned something most people never do. When you give love without needing it back, it never really leaves. My father and I don't speak often. We exchange letters now and then, updates, polite check-ins, but we both know the truth. Some gaps are never closed completely, and that's okay. I no longer carry anger toward him, only understanding. He was broken in ways I'll never fully grasp. But Grandpa, he chose to heal, to love, to stay. That's who I follow now. That's whose shadow I walk in. And sometimes when I stand in the mirror and adjust Grandpa's old watch on my wrist, I see a bit of him looking back at me. Not just in the reflection, but in the man I've become. And I smile, because I know wherever he is, he's proud. And I'll keep living in a way that honors him, even in the smallest acts. Because sometimes, the smallest acts leave the greatest legacy. Sometimes I wonder what Grandpa would say if he could see me now. Not just the surface of my life, but the choices I make in the quiet, the way I treat people when no one is watching, the way I show up for others, the way he showed up for me. I think he'd smile, tilt his head like he always did, and say, "You turned out all right, kid." Not because I'm perfect, not because I've done everything right, but because I've learned the lesson he spent a lifetime trying to teach. Love is not measured by what you get, it's measured by what you give. And in a world that often rewards ego and noise, he chose silence and substance. He lived in the shadows of humility, and somehow, from there, he lit up my entire life. Now, every year on the day he passed, I take a long walk. I don't bring my phone, I don't talk to anyone. I just walk, and I think about everything he endured, everything he forgave, everything he gave without ever expecting anything in return. I stop by the old tree behind where the house once stood. It's still there, taller now, stronger, just like me. I sit at its roots, close my eyes, and breathe. Sometimes I read his letter again. Sometimes I just listen. And every time I leave, I whisper the same promise. I'll keep going, Grandpa. I'll keep choosing love. Because the world may forget a name. It may erase photos, sell houses, throw away possessions. But it can't erase impact. And his impact, it's alive in me. So if you've heard this story and something inside you feels heavy, or familiar, or deeply moved, don't let that moment pass. Let it guide you. Reach out to the person you've been avoiding. Forgive what you thought was unforgivable. Stay when it's easier to leave. And above all, love, even when it's not returned. Because in the end, we all become stories. And what kind of story we leave behind is entirely up to us. My grandfather's story was quiet, overlooked by many. But to me, it was everything. And now, it's yours too. So carry it. Pass it on. And if ever someone asks you why you chose kindness when you had every reason not to, tell them this: because love stayed with a dying man and changed a life forever.